This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And it's the 30th of July, I think. We're recording on a Saturday for Sunday broadcast. I want to take you to a glaciated landscape that is we deal with at Rantoul a lot. But this week has been a peak on the prairie, and people have been calling me to say that the prairie I'm going to talk about is rather beautiful at the present time. Let me go back to the original before settlement time. If you take an east-west transect, you have the lobes of a glacial landscape, and you have, starting from about where 57 runs north-south, just above 57, there is a moraine. It's a Posodum moraine, and these days the outwash plain is to the west of that. It depends on where you are with various lobes. But the glacier 10,000 years ago would have sat there. It would have gradually brought down rock and rubble from the Laurentian Shield and deposited at a place where the temperature was enough to melt the ice. You may have had as much as 200 feet of ice at some stage, but basically before the glacier warmed and closed out and retreated, it may have only been 4 feet of ice. It would have dribbled out into an outwash plain creek, which I think goes to the Kaskaskia. Now, if we walk over that hill, which is basically Duncan Road these days, you can imagine coming from Monticello and going east, you're going over 57, up onto the moraine, and Duncan Road is there. It's very near to Monticello Road. Monticello Road is east-west and basically very straight, and it would have the same configuration of moving up the steeper slope on the west side of the moraine where the ice was melting. And this is where there is an accumulation of gravel and glacial till, which is ground. Sometimes if you look at some of the stones, you'll find striations where the rock has been held by the glacier as it moves south. And that glacial till gradually over 10,000 years has been activated with prairie, with plants and animals, and created a soil. The soil in the advanced area of the glacier would have been Drummer and Flanagan, probably. A little drier on the backside or the east side of the moraine, which gently slopes down to the Ombra River, and then up another steep slope to the Yankee Ridge moraine, and again the gentle slope going east towards Sydney. So if you're wanting to do that transit, let me remind you again, flatland, which is basically very flat from Monticello through to Champaign, across 57, up the face of the moraine, and Duncan Road would run north and south, and has the configuration of a glacial landscape with block drainage here and there, and little streams coming off it and running into the Kaskaskia. Then over the moraine, probably only 50 or 100 feet high, higher than the outwash plain. And it slopes down gently because the rock and rubble would basically fall where the glacier melted, but some of it would fall out, creating a sort of slope to the Ombra and then to the front or the advanced edge of the Yankee Ridge moraine, which is somewhat higher and more prominent, and then a gentle slope down to Sydney. Before settlement, there were creeks that would run into the Ombra, and there would be block drainage, swampland on the Ombra. To put you into the picture of the Ombra, you go to Meadowbrook Park, and there is the start of some of the rivers or creeks that eventually create the Ombra. They run through University Forest area and have creeks that come off that sloping Pisota moraine. So Mattis Park is one of those areas that was swampy and had a creek that ran down the slope of the Pisota moraine to the Ombra. On the other side, on the Yankee Ridge side, there would be probably a slightly faster flowing creek, or two or three or four. They were palmate, and if you put your hand out, you would simulate the various creeks running off of the Yankee Ridge moraine. The Ombra would meander and eventually join up with the Wabash and the Ohio and Mississippi and down to the Gulf. Well, as development came, early settlement would be up the rivers, especially at flood time, when you had enough draft to be able to do that. So settlement early was along the river banks. Later came the railroads in the 1850s, and the railroad that we have was the Illinois Central. Illinois Central was given money to create or land to create a railroad, and it created its own design. It went through the landscape in the best way it could find, possibly sometimes in the best political way it could find. And it runs along part of the Pisota moraine. So if you're on Neal Street South or Route 45, There's a creek there that runs from Mattis Park through underneath the railroad line and down through University territory to join the Umbra. So that's one of the palmate drainages, drainage coming in from the east and from the west. Sometimes native fish would come up those streams and find little ponds that where they could live and enjoy life. But then if you had a drought, the creek would dry up, but leave the ponds. So at times we could find rather large fish trapped in a pond. If it rained significantly, the fish could escape. Sometimes those fish were carp, which is a fairly common but rather invasive fish. So now you gradually have settlement, usually about 5 miles apart, and the area I want to take you to is Savoy. So Savoy had a railroad depot and an elevator. The elevator is still there. The depot has been moved to Duncan Road, where it is now a residence. But early on, Savoy was a little town with a main street, which is Church Road, and it still has the elements of that history. Gradually, the farmland went from being mostly cattle and dairying and beef cattle to row crops. And then eventually the settlement has occurred. And it's almost wall-to-wall settlement, which means that there's a lot more water in that little Palmate Creek that runs through underneath the road at Windsor Road. So I'm going to take you to Curtis Road, and near Curtis Road, there's a project. When you have native creeks, they tend to meander. They tend to have gooseneck meanders, where there's the meander goes out and creates a narrow neck. And it's very tempting to put a dam in at one place and collect the water in the meander. So that has become Lake Park. The excess water which comes off the Pusota Moraine was channeled through a cutting. It's very tempting when this meander comes almost back to meeting itself, then to cut that gooseneck and let the water run straight through. So you capture enough water to make a lake, but you let the rest of the water bypass and go through directly. And the aim of early settlers was to get as much water off the territory as quick as possible. You have to know that if you're going to have a meander that is perhaps the best part of a mile long, then it's going to have some fall. So the meander at the west end is higher than the meander at the east end. And uh, so if you cut that gooseneck, you're going to have water move at a rapid pace through that cutting. And that is what has happened. When the Lake Park development was proposed by Burwash and others, they had to deal with that cutoff. It was about 45-degree angle and not very conducive to growing vegetation quickly. It would grow a few willow trees, which weren't in favor from a farming point of view, because what the willows do is allow the water to stay. And if you're concerned about aquifers and the water that goes into them, then your philosophy would be to leave the willows to let the water accumulate and drain slowly into the aquifer. But that wasn't the policy for farming. It was to drain the water quickly. So you didn't necessarily encourage the willows, and you tried to get vegetation on the 45-degree angle of the cutoff. The 45-degree angle meant that there was a slope that was would have local erosion and not a lot of topsoil. The glacial till gradually molded and matured into soil would be on the top of the cutoff, but not down the slopes. So the soil was a little more clay and not conducive to growing brome grass and ryegrass and mostly grasses on the side of the cutoff. So I was talking to Dick Burwash, who lived on the development that they put together, and he was talking about the problem of not being able to stabilize grass or vegetation on that slope. And I said, well, you could put prairie there and it would have deep roots and control it. But the difference would be that if you're trying to get vegetation to grow in 10 days, which you can do with some of the roadside plants that are designed to create a green growth fairly quickly. And so how long would it take to generate a protective area on the 45-degree angle? Well, give it 10 years, perhaps 5 years, and perhaps some less than that, but you have to have patience. Well, Dick suggested that we go ahead with that, and we did, and planted next to his place a lot of little blue stem, because little blue stem would have perhaps half a mile of rootlets that go down and prevent erosion. And they will grow in sometimes in a season. There will be some growth, especially of the parts of the plant that are below the soil level, and it worked. So it took a few years, but the little blue stem had young ones and gradually created a erosion control. And we did the same sort of thing for the whole distance of the cutoff. It still had a problem of water flow because not only were you going to get glacial runoff, but you now are going to get the runoff from roofs and roads and all the excess runoff from subdevelopment, and also the drains. Most all of the agricultural land especially would have been drained with underground pipes, sometimes 4 feet underground, with a gentle slope into the main drainage ditch. There was a technology to this, and part of the reason for the establishment of universities in the Midwest was to teach people how to work with the landscape. To put in these drains, you needed tiles. And so if you go to Bloomington, there were big areas of clay that could be created into pipes. The pipes might be about 10 inches long and about 5 inches thick, but there were junctions, and those pipes could take on moisture and gradually channel it to bigger drains and eventually some corrugated iron drains that you can see running out into the drains. The meandering waterways would be straightened out, leaving little areas where plants used to grow. So if you see a sycamore growing on a meander that has been cut off, then you know that's where the meander used to run. And it is interesting biologically because that has the structure of a meandering stream. It is one side will tend to cut in, one side will act as a beach, and the organisms will sort themselves out according to that moisture gradient. Well, that happened all over, and Lake Park is only one example of it. But when development came along, there was more water to deal with. So Glenda Lane and other people from the Lake Park approached the agricultural people and asked if they could have some sort of stability to the about a quarter of a mile cutoff. The suggestion was to put in groins. Groins are riprap dropped into there's a cut across the meander. It's there that you have a base for the groin, and then you put in riprap to the extent that you have a small waterfall. And that small waterfall controls the water flow. If you have a 5-inch rainfall, you don't have the cutoff eroding on either side and having a torrent of water going through too fast. So working with the soil conservation people, they got grants to put in 6 groins, and that saved the erosion a lot. And it also created a backup pond for each of those groins. And that created a place for wetland species and not stagnant, but slow flowing water that would allow a different sort of organism to be there. Gradually, the groins, which possibly about 2 or 3 feet high, not awfully high, would grow over, and you hardly notice that they're there, but they do slow the water. Well, gradually, the prairie along the banks got to be interesting, and Dick decided to let us expand for 8 feet, and we put a walkway down there so that people could enjoy seeing the early growing prairie. At this time, Route 45 was being expanded. Early on in the 60s, this was a 2-lane highway. It was taking a lot more traffic, so it went to a 3-lane highway. And then it got expanded further to having 2 lanes and a turn lane in the middle and 2 lanes again. So it was a very wide road. And so with the help of Helen Satterthwaite and others, we got a grant for moving some of the prairie that was going to be destroyed by the road and put it in tandem trucks and take it to Dick Burwash's area at Lake Park. There was a 40-acre site that is now between Curtis Road and First Street. It has an organization, an apartment complex called The Place, and there's a prairie, it's not assisted living, but it's a retirement village. And then there's Winfield Village. So we expanded into Dick Burwash's agricultural land. He was growing corn and soybeans there, and there were some little rills that ran into the cutoff, so it wasn't exactly level. For people who are used to mountains, it would be level, but in our sensitivity, a 6-inch rise is different. And you take notice of it, and you notice if there's block drainage, and perhaps if there is block drainage, you put a tile in and let it run into that cutoff, or if it's beyond the cutoff, you let it run into the general stream. That was probably 35 years ago, might even be more than that. And we took some of the prairie from Route 45 to that conservation easement and dumped it. It was aided by Martin Equipment, which loaned us a front-end loader, which allowed us to not only pick up some of the prairie, but also to spread it out. It was most useful where we had a backhoe to put about 10 inches of topsoil with this prairie into tandem trucks, and the tandem trucks would go around to the prairie site and dump the prairie sod. The sod, you have to know, is very heavy, and you have to know that if you don't plant it properly, within a day or so, you're going to lose the elements of prairie in it. So the advantage of having a front-end loader, or a fairly big loader, was that you could put tongs into the mound which had been dumped by the tandem truck through the sod and turn it over. So it's right way up. And then you could put it together like you would construct a lawn. Some of the planting was put together fairly close. Some of it was put together a little distant. You needed the closeness because most construction goes on in summer, and you have a rainfall pattern of wet spring, dry summer, wet fall. And most construction goes on when you have a dry summer. So if you put the prairie plant out by itself, it's likely to be subject to drought. So a lot of the prairie was put fairly close to each other. And if possible, if we had some extra dirt, we would put it around the plant so that it would not have air accessing the roots. All the residents on the south side of the drainage ditch were intrigued and interested and very helpful because they provided water. In nature, you don't have the luxury of water to save the soul of your transplants. But in this case, we could water the transplants and they did very well. And that was rather generous, and people tended to get together and help us establish. And where we didn't have enough prairie to go around, we had seed that we had gathered at other places. Some of the seed that's at prairie, the Lake Park, came from remnant prairie at Rantoul. Gradually over the years, those plants have grown and expanded. At the moment, there's probably more compass plant and dock than we might have wanted to have a general prairie. You have to know when you're planting a prairie that remnant prairies may be specific for a specific niche. It may not necessarily have 110 species that belong to a prairie. If you're planting a prairie with seed, you can have something that looks like a prairie with just 12 prairie plants that are survivors. Rough and tough, but interesting. If you want to have more than that, you can have 24 plants or 50 plants. That's plant species. But then you're getting into special niches. And you can create niches if you want. If you want a wet spot, you can make a hole in the ground with a front end loader, but it actually disturbs the soil some to do that. So you might be going down onto clay. So it doesn't always work, but you simulate what you can. You have a dry spot. It might be that there's a little bit of glacial till somewhere, so you put drier plants there like little blue stem. If you're an arborist and you're trying to create a site with 110 species, that's an arboretum. That's not really a native prairie. Very few prairies would have that range of species, but it's there. If you go to the botanical gardens in St. Louis, you will have a good spectrum of prairie species. Well, we probably had about 50 species, and they've been growing and seemingly very happy to be where they are. And in the middle to late July, they're looking rather elegant. You have whole acreages of species. In the early spring, you have starry-eyed grass and pussy toes and things that pussy toes is about 6 or 8 inches high. You have early liliaceous plants. You have hyacinths, and so the prairie is coming out of winter is rather low in spectrum. It's especially low if you burn, and we'll get into that later. But gradually, the bee balm, it's a balm for bees, is there in acreage. There's a rattlesnake master. At the moment, there's spurge, which is related to poinsettia. It's a white flower. There's rosinweed and quinine suggesting that there's a chemical there, and we have to know that we should keep these heritage prairies for their biodiversity and the biochemicals that are there. We may need a biochemical, or we may need the plant to allow, instead of planting, for instance, a bean crop and planting it each year, you might be able to make a perennial crop. So it pays you to have your genetics around. There's a nice clump of Culver's root, so named by the doctor who probably found a chemical in it. And so the slopes are rich in grasses, big blue stem, Indian grass, little blue stem, and there are clumps of cordgrass. The cordgrass came with the establishment of the prairie. It grows about 10 feet tall. It has very elegant leaves that curl over. It is dense. You can put a child in the middle of a clump of compass of I'm missing the name, but it takes 10 years to grow from seed, but if you take the clones of cordgrass, it will grow and expand, and it has done so. And it's very elegant. The person that you put in the clump will not be able to hear the train that's a mile away. It drops sound. And with these additions, like New Jersey tea or Baptisia, with its pods. There are legumes. There's lead plant. There's not a lot of these getting to be more exotic plants, but you get the feeling in just 2.5 acres of what it was like to walk into a prairie. It grows slowly, but by the time you've got to late July, some of those tall silphiums that are belong to the compositae or sunflower families, and some of them are 12 feet tall. The compass plant is the nth degree in preservation. Its leaves face north and south so that the sunlight doesn't burn the water out of the plant. They're hard and hairy, so the wind doesn't dry them out. They have leaves that are invaginated, so there's not a lot of surface to be dried out. And they have deep, deep roots. We brought in some compass plants that the top 2 feet weighed 45 pounds, and the crown of the plant was 10 inches around. If you looked at it in early spring, you would think this was a young plant, but if you go to dig it up and transplant it as a young plant, it's not. It's been there for a long time. We had people for this project to dig up compass plants and dock on a railroad bed that was retiring in the Dewey Fisher area. And the people who brought the backhoes to do that were amazed because you couldn't see anything, yet they were digging up roots that were absolutely huge. And we transplanted them, and they have grown and they have seeded, and they're there and they're numerous, probably more numerous than in a traditional prairie. Maybe you would get a clump of compass plant. The flowers are rugged, rather beautiful. The plants have they're knobbly on a stalk that is substantial, as compared with dock, which is rather more refined, but it can also go up high. But you have to treat it a little more gently. It has huge elephant ear leaves that allow it to keep cool, and you can put your hands on either side of the leaf and you feel it is cool. These plants know how to survive the wetness of spring and the fall and the dryness of summer. The dock doesn't go quite so deeply, but you can transplant it if you wish, but it also grows, both those plants grow well from seed. If you transplant it and you cut off the roots, say 2 or 3 feet down, there are adventitious roots, adventitious buds on the root, which grow back. So when you leave a site with a dock or compass plant, you will find it growing back in years to come. The area has been put into conservation farmland in the sense that this is a set-aside site. So the trails that we put through are not being mown, and the compass plants or the cordgrass or what have you will fall over the trail. It's rather interesting in a way because people that walk the trail in an unmown state will have to lift this 10-foot length of flowering compass plant and duck under it. And in so doing, you can feel the ruggedness of the stem and know that this is a plant that survives. In amongst that, there will be smaller plants. So you don't want to have an overdose of grasses. The grasses are relatively aggressive, and if you give them a chance, they will dominate the broadleaves. The broadleaves are probably 110 possible broadleaves. We don't have anything like that in the Prairie at Lake Park. It's more like 50 species, but they attract insects and birds. The red-winged blackbird will scold you for invading their territory, and so you'll be able to triangulate. If you stay in one place and the bird scolds you, then you know that's part of its territory, and you go a little further away, and you get scolded again, and you can work out what the nesting nature of this is. The insects are numerous. The butterflies are wonderful. And it's amazing that a small acreage of 2.5 acres attracts such a range of species, including a snake or two, lots of rabbits, and every once in a while, a coyote that can come and souvenir your pet cat or dog if you're not careful. One of the problems we have is that corn and soybeans is not a habitat for general wildlife. So when people get to be interested in growing habitat in their yards and backyards, you're going to have a real input of the wildlife coming into town. So you have a hawk, and it's getting to be biodiversity. You hope there's some connectivity, but it is often rather minimal. But insects do fly, and winds do blow, and in a marvelous way, you get to have a wildlife habitat. And if you were wanting to visit this site at the moment, it is generous in its beauty, and it's taken 30 odd years for it to get to that stage. But Lake Park is rather proud of it, but only in sections. Some people in Lake Park don't get the chance to or the time to enjoy it. It takes a little bit of talent to know your species and to visit not just once but many times. People do use the area for walking, but sometimes I wonder if they know what they're looking at. There are invasive species. There's a reed canary grass that grows in the swale, and it's very, very difficult to get rid of it. You have to take off the fruiting bodies so that it doesn't have a seed source, but it can invade your swale and destroy your prairie, especially the wetland part of it. There's also Canada thistle. Let me tell you that the west side of this 2.5 acres was adjacent to development, and developers do not like to develop on topsoil. It's much better to have your foundations in a clay-based soil that's not so organically oriented and matured. So Lake Park did a deal with the developers to put up a berm that's probably about 15, 20 feet high, and it runs along the north side. And if you walk along that, you can look over the prairie and get an idea. You can look to the east and you can see the elements of the Yankee Ridge Moraine with the Ombra in front of it, and relate your little creek, which is a cutoff to the prairie. It's the sort of thing that you want to visit fairly often. Some elements of that prairie came from Airport Road. Airport Road is on 45, and at one stage it was designed to be widened, and I was tempted to suggest to the Department of Transportation that this was a remnant prairie and it deserved to be preserved. Well, they closed that construction site for 3 days and worked with the Natural History Survey and verified that this was good prairie. So with the aid of about $1 million worth of equipment, low loaders and tree spoons and wires to put a cage around the soil that you were taking, much of this remnant prairie was taken 9 miles to a Pisodum rest stop on 57. There was already a rough, tough prairie there to let people know what was the traditional heritage of this area. And so tree spoons were made to take out a triangle of soil and replace it with a triangle of prairie. It grew very well until the Department of Transportation decided to expand the sanitary treatment area of the roadside stopping place. They might have been able to buy land from the adjacent farmers, but probably would have had to pay an arm and a leg for it. So what they did was they put the sewer treatment drains into the prairie, and that was rather sad. I stood there long enough to suggest that something different could be done, but I was threatened to be arrested if I didn't stop my activity there. Going back to the Airport Road, we took some of that interesting soil and brought it to Lake Park. So I can actually tell you where we dumped that soil with its seed, and sometimes it came with railroad weeds like mullein, and so that patch is a little more weedy, and you have to know that disturbing the soil provides opportunities for invasive species like teasel to grow. And so you have to be careful, because even your prairie plants can become invasive weeds if they have just the right opportunity. The opportunity comes in various stages. Some years, certain plants, purple coneflower is one that will be everywhere. And then the next 3, 5, 10 years, the weather environment will not be quite ideal, and you'll only have a few purple coneflowers. Sometimes the wimpy pale purple coneflower, which is our native, will be bred to be a more rigorous purple coneflower that can survive, but we don't encourage that one. We go with the native one. Sometimes we have weevils, and the silphiums are subject to weevils. That's the dock and compass plant and rosinweed. And some of the soft sunflowers, we never get to collect the seed because the weevils will use that as food. So if you're an entomologist, you will get to know your friendly weevils. So it's been a wonderful experience, and perhaps you might like to visit Lake Park Prairie. You have to behave yourself and not pick flowers, and Lake Park allows you to do that. And Lake Park is currently working on Canada thistle to remove it because it is a very invasive weed. So I think we're getting near to the end of the show. And so this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.